Good afternoon, everybody. Now I've learned it. When I started this morning, I said good morning because it's still morning for me. First of all, let me thank the organizers for inviting me. It's a pleasure and an honor for me to be with you now only in 2D. I would have liked to come in person, and Dr. Salom just mentioned my stay in 2018, which I really enjoyed very much. But I'm also happy that I have the chance to interact with you in this virtual meeting today. So it's a great pleasure for me to be invited as a speaker for this meeting, and I thank the organizers for organizing such a wonderful meeting on a very timely issue. It has already been mentioned by several previous speakers how important mangroves are, and I also want to thank Dr. Salom and express my sincere gratitude for all the work she's doing as an ICSA ambassador. That is very important because we're always looking for more members around the globe, and it's she mentioned all the important topics that ECSA is covering, and I'm a member of the council and a coordinator for the international conferences, which is in a way our core business to spread knowledge, which means we meet in conferences all over the globe. That means it's very good to have these biannual large international conferences, but what is also very important is to have these focus meetings, these which have a thematic or a geographic regional focus, and that's why I'm very happy that Dr. Salom and the team at the University of Kerala are organizing this event. And when I heard about the title, and Dr. Sabu mentioned, and I think Dr. Jaya also mentioned it, mangroves are now most prominent, I think, for this blue carbon, for this climate regulation ecosystem service. And this is one of my major topics of work. But I have decided not to speak about this because of the title of this event, which is more focused on the fishery potential. And that is why, and I'm also not talking directly about the mangroves, but more on the role of mangroves in the association of these valuable coastal habitats that you find in tropical and subtropical regions. And I'm now going to share my presentation. Yeah, so because of the title of this meeting, the title of my talk is Mangrove Conversion to Aquaculture Ponds Impairs Downstream Ecosystems and the Fishery Potential. I'm definitely not a fishery scientist, but I just want to highlight the relevance of mangroves for the fishery potential as being one of the major ecosystem services. Well, when you're a mangrove lover, like myself, you probably...
Sir.
Pardon?
Dr. Tim,
Yeah.
please go to the slideshow mode. Then only it will be...
Pardon? To what?
Clear. Slideshow mode, PowerPoint.
Slideshow?
It is in the right side, right corner.
But I am in slideshow mode.
Anyway, go. You can go.
Full screen. You put on full screen. Full screen.
Full screen.
Yeah.
Dr. Tim, please go to the toolbar and just to go to slideshow view.
Yeah.
You go to slideshow.
Yeah.
And then full screen.
Yeah. The icon of the full screen.
Okay.
So sharing. Now it is not
So,
shared.
can you see it? Can you see it now?
No, you have to share it first. First you share it, and then now you can see.
It's there?
Yeah, now you can. Yeah, it's there. But now you can share the full screen icon.
So I'm now in slideshow mode.
No, sir. You just go to slideshow in the toolbar.
Yeah, I am in slideshow. I see the slideshow here.
Oh.
Yeah, it's there, but it's not in full screen.
It is in full screen.
Full view. You can. Yeah. It's there, but in the side you can see all the slides. In the bottom there's an icon, the full screen slideshow icon. Or else it is okay. I think you can present like this.
Yes, sir.
You can see it. Yeah. I think we can continue. We are able to see it. It's okay.
You can see it, yeah?
Yes.
Yeah. You can continue. You can continue.
Okay, good. So to pick up again, I'm talking about the role of mangroves in this association of ecosystem services. So when you're a mangrove lover like I'm, you probably know all of these or many of these ecosystem services, or which are the benefits that people derive from mangroves. Among them are climate regula. Oh, sorry. Among them are climate regulation, as mentioned, the blue carbon storage, but there's also coastal protection, water filtration, tourism, and last but not least, of course, also fisheries are a very important ecosystem service. But we also know that there were lots of threats to the mangroves. So there was a large mangrove loss in the second half of the last century, which is now going back there. So, but the major drivers of mangrove loss are shown here, one of which is climate change. But what is even much more important are those man-made drivers of mangrove loss, like logging, agriculture, aquaculture, pollution, and coastal development. And they are all driving this mangrove loss and this coastal development, this intertidal habitat. So just let's have a look. What do we find in South Asia, in particular in India? Of course, the largest single mangrove forest on the planet, the Sundarbans, which is shared with Bangladesh, is of course belongs also to the mangroves of India. And then you have a very long, your country has a very long coastline and mangroves in several places, and also in Kerala, which cannot be seen here that well. So that's why I found another map which also shows us the spots of mangrove distribution along the coast of Kerala, which in total is about 6 square kilometers or 600 hectares. Yeah, but I'm not going to talk about mangroves in India, but talking about some research.
Can I interrupt 1 minute? Your slides are not changing. Are you changing slides?
So,
are you changing your slides?
Yes.
But yeah, we cannot. We are not able to view our slide change. It's still in the first slide for us.
Yeah. What shall I do?
Slide. I think you can. You just click in the slideshow. Now it is in home. Now it is in home. You just click in the slideshow. The parallel to home, you can see the slideshow. Click in the slideshow parallel to home.
So I see it working.
Yeah, but it's not working. Yeah. Now we can see. Yeah. Now it's changing. Yeah.
Yeah, but now I'm not in presentation. You can see it, but I'm not in presentation mode now. That's funny.
Oh, okay. But we see that you are presenting.
Okay, so now you see this Kerala mangrove map, yeah?
Yeah, Kerala mangrove distribution.
But you didn't see the previous slides. So
no,
I will not go in full. I will not go in presentation mode, but stay in this, yeah.
Okay. Can you change one more slide so that?
So you also did not see the previous slides, only the first one.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. So then, but now the.
Yeah, now it's changing.
Okay.
Now it's changing.
Something else I can do is.
Yeah, I think you have to go to the presenter mode.
Again, presenter mode? Okay, I'll try.
No,
Hello.
Full screen. Yeah.
So now you see this ecosystem service slide?
Yeah. It's
Sir,
there.
can you see the comment box bottom? Sir, hello.
Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah.
Sir, can you see the comment box, the bottom level, bottom toolbox comments?
Comments. No, I cannot see.
Yeah,
the comments right now.
Fourth one icon.
No, Nasib, no, we'll guide. Nasib. Yeah, it's a parallel to home. You can see the slideshow there. You can just click the slideshow if you want, or else you can continue because it's moving.
That's strange. Yesterday it was working when we tried it.
Right, it was working during the trial. I gave the in full screen yesterday. You just click this icon, the icon which gives the full screen.
So do you see the slides now?
Jim, sir?
Yeah?
Yeah, slides are there, but
Ma'am, do one thing. You just go to the toolbar, sir. Home, insert, design in the top of that, left top.
But I don't
Home,
understand
there's
you.
a
design,
slideshow.
transition, animation, and slideshow. You choose slideshow.
So now I'm in slideshow mode.
Oh, sir.
Do you see the slides?
In the slideshow, itself,
Sorry, I didn't understand you.
slides are there, but in the slideshow,
I do not understand you.
yeah.
The audio is very bad.
Slideshow, okay, I think, yeah, you continue. The slides are now moving. I think you can continue, please. You continue. The slides are now moving. Yeah.
So now you see this mangrove ecosystem service slide, yeah? Hello? Do you see it?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir, it is visible.
Yes, sir. You can.
Yeah,
Yes, sir.
it's visible. You can see. You can see. You can continue.
Okay, so these are the ecosystem services, the benefits that people derive from mangroves. Among them are, of course, climate regulation, as already mentioned, the blue carbon storage, which is also one of my major topics. But other important ecosystem services are coastal protection, water filtration, and also fisheries, which is one of the major themes of this meeting. Yeah, but we also know that a lot of mangroves was lost in the second half of the last century, about 35%, and there are a lot of threats to the mangroves, this intertidal habitat, one of them being climate change, of course, but more important are mostly these human activities like logging, agriculture, aquaculture, pollution, and also coastal development, which are threatening mangroves and also all these ecosystem services. So this is something that we have to take into account. Now, just let's have a look. Where do we find mangroves in India or in South Asia here? This is from a paper from a couple of years ago, just showing that India's coast also is lined to some extent by mangroves, not all the coast, because it's a very long coastline, but with the Sundarbans, it also hosts the largest single mangrove forest on the planet, shared with Bangladesh. And if you look on this map and we look at Kerala, we even don't see too many mangroves there, but I found another map showing all the spots in Kerala, and there's roughly 6 square kilometers or 600 hectares of mangroves also in Kerala. So it's also important in Kerala. Well, but now if we do not look at mangroves in isolation, we see there's a lot of connection to adjacent habitats, for example, to the terrestrial vegetation. Here you see terrestrial forest on the landward side of the mangroves, and then we have the mangroves themselves as an intertidal habitat connecting land and sea, but close to them we have seagrasses and coral reefs also in the tropical regions. And there's a lot of interaction as shown here by the yellow arrows, for example, and we see in particular, if we take a look at the bottom part, we see there's a lot of exchange with these ecosystems, with the seagrasses and the coral reefs, and this is also very important for fish, the export or the movement of invertebrate and fish larvae, as well as the migration of adults. So that's why the mangroves are also very important for other ecosystems, and they also benefit from the interaction with other ecosystems. So
Tim, the slides are not moving again.
so I see
Can you just
everything's
try?
frozen here. Oh, no, okay.
Yeah, there I think it's moving for you, but we are not able to view. Now it's moving. Now it's moving.
Now
Yeah, now we can
I
see. Now
left
it's moving.
presentation
Now
mode again.
yeah. Yeah.
Okay,
No,
I'll continue
no,
like
no,
that.
no, you can continue.
I'm not doing a
When it's not
presentation.
moving,
You
I'll
are
just tell
doing
you.
like this. And so I'm
Okay, so if it's not moving, I'll just intimate you. Sorry, if it's not moving, I'll just intimate you, and you can. Okay.
so, but you now see this ecosystem connectivity slide, yeah?
Mangroves support other coastal
Yeah, okay,
ecosystems. Yeah.
good.
Yeah.
Yeah, as you can see there, we have all these ecosystems in connection there, close to each other, and you find these associations not everywhere, but in many parts of tropical coasts, you find these mangroves, seagrasses, and coral reefs. And also terrestrial forests, and there's a lot of exchange between these ecosystems, and that's why they also provide, there's a lot of connection between these ecosystems, and that's very important. So they benefit from each other. They provide protection to each other in terms of a filter for any land-derived substances, or a physical protection against wave, etc. So there's a lot of benefits these ecosystems have from each other, and that's why understanding this interaction is also very important, and the mangroves play an important role in this, in particular also as highlighted in the bottom part for the migration and the export of invertebrate fish larvae and also adults. So, and if we now look at the coastlines and the population living within 100 kilometers of the coast, and the alterations or modifications of the coastline, here we see that in these days there's more and more people living close to the coast or directly at the coast, and many of them also directly economically depending on the natural resources of the coast. So, and because of the increase in population, there's an increase in demand for these natural resources of the coast, which of course then threatens the existence of these important, in particular, the vegetated coastal habitats. And if we take a look at India, we see with red and orange lined coast, it means they are among the most altered coasts that you find on the planet. So therefore, it's also very important to look at this development there. So a major problem these days is that this coastal development and resource overexploitation endanger the integrity and ecosystem service supply of coastal ecosystems. And I'm not reporting about work from India I did, but today I'm reporting about work that we did in China or still do in China, which is also a quite extreme example in this context. That's why it is also so useful, because we can really see these strong effects that some of these coastal development processes can have. So you still see my slides, yeah? Right?
Yeah, we can
Okay.
see it, Jim. We can see.
Good.
Yeah.
Then let's move to the next. Go to the place where we work in the island of Hainan in China. It's the largest special economic zone of China, and it was established in 1988. It has about 9 million inhabitants now, and it's in the tropical part of China, and this is where we worked. And on the lower right, you see the most important business sectors. They are tourism, agriculture, industry, but also fisheries and aquacultures, for those that don't have direct numbers, but they have important contributions to the GDP. And tourism is the most expanding sector in the past years. And that's why Hainan is also called the Hawaii of China. You see, it has beautiful beaches, and it's in the tropics, it's warm, and it's, yeah, and people are really dressing like in Hawaii. You can see it there. It's not a fake. This is what people are doing. And of course, what you expect there is not only beautiful beaches, but you expect also something like that. Of course, you want to see colorful coral reefs with a lot of colorful fish. Unfortunately, this is a photo I found on the internet, and this is not what you get in Hainan. So what you get in Hainan instead is this. These are images from taken by people from our team a couple of years ago in 5 coral reefs on the northeast coast of Hainan, showing you that all of these coral reefs are very degraded. The coral life cover is around 5%, sometimes even less. And you see there's only very few fish around. So these are not the very beautiful, healthy coastal ecosystems that we want. And just to give you an idea and a sketch how it looks, this is how all these coastal the coastal zone looked like, and in the middle of the last century in Hainan. You had all these nice ecosystems over there. We had rivers introducing their terrestrial loads into the coastal sea, lush mangroves over there, and in estuaries, and there were seagrasses and coral reefs. There were fishermen which could sustain their livelihoods just from fishing in the area, and aquaculture didn't play a large role at that time. But with the population increase and the coastal development, there was also larger use of the coast and the conversion of the use of the coast, and we had aquaculture, agriculture, and sewage input and overfishing as a consequence of this coast development and use, impairing the ecosystem health of the coastal zone. And I'm now going to show you some of the results of our work. This map is just showing you the area where we worked on the northeast coast of Hainan. And we were looking at this association of ecosystems. In dark green, you see the extension of mangrove forest there, which is not too much. But if you add the pink color, which is for the aquaculture ponds, this is all the former mangroves. So there were much more mangroves a couple of decades ago. And then seaward in light green, you see the seagrass meadows, and seaward of that in blue, you have the fringing coral reefs. And I also showed you different areas that we were investigating with different exposure to aquaculture ponds. So in the upper part in Yelin, we had a fairly low input, a low exposure to aquaculture ponds, also low input of untreated effluents into coastal waters. While in Changchi, we had a very high input because of a large amount and large area of aquaculture ponds. And at the bottom in yellow, you see Chinghe, where we had medium exposure and also medium input. So what happened over there, and this is something we could reconstruct from satellite image analysis, is that there was a dramatic loss of 72% of mangrove area from the late 1960s to 2010. And at the same time, there was a large increase in aquaculture pond area. It was mostly direct conversion of mangrove forest to aquaculture ponds. And the present day extent of aquaculture pond area was reached round about the year 2000. So for about 20 years, coastal waters are exposed to the untreated effluents of aquaculture ponds released from these ponds. And you could even see it if you take a look at Google Earth images. What you can see here first in the upper part of the Google Earth image is there's lots and lots of ponds around in the area. And if you go to the lower image, you can see there's the ponds near the coast, and there's a small rim of 25 to 50 meters of mangrove forest left. And directly in the beach, you have these small outlet channels from which the aquaculture effluents are being released into the coastal back reef areas. And this is how it looks like. Yeah, you can see this water running through the beach and being released into the coastal waters. And this is, of course, all the untreated effluent is released into the waters. And in terms of nitrogen, it also means, of course, a lot of dissolved inorganic nitrogen input. And the nitrogen concentration there in these coastal waters is 20 to 50 times as high as in unaffected coastal waters. So if we translate this into data, what I'm showing you here is in the upper panel, the dissolved inorganic nitrogen concentration in micromoles, which is the sum of nitrate, nitrite, and ammonium for the three areas: Yelin with low pond exposure, Chinghe with medium pond exposure, and Changchi with high pond exposure. So this is, in a way, the fuel that drives primary production. It's one of the major nutrients. And the green dashed line shows you what you should expect in pristine tropical water. So in a way, the background value. And we see in all cases, and these are transects, which we have done from 50 meters off the coast to 1,000 meters. And we see in all cases, the concentrations of dissolved inorganic nitrogen in these coastal waters are higher than this background value, and they are highest in the area where we have the highest pond exposure and also the highest input of aquaculture effluents. Then the lower panel shows you chlorophyll A in micrograms per liter, which is in a way, it's a proxy for biomass. So in a way, that's the result of nutrient inputs taken up. It's converted into primary production. And again, the values, all the values are higher than the background value of 1 micrograms per liter, which you find in pristine tropical waters. And again, they are highest in Changchi to the right, where we have the highest input. So it's a clear indication of eutrophication of the coastal waters. And we then try to trace this into the coastal waters and look at the fate of this nitrogen. And that's why we were looking at the isotope composition of this dissolved inorganic nitrogen. And on the left-hand side, you see the delta 15N of ammonium. And this is the major portion of what is being released from aquaculture effluents. It's ammonium, and it has a very high delta 15N of 13 per mil on average. On the right-hand side, we see the major input that comes from agriculture, which has a much lower delta 15, roughly around 6%. So it can be very easily distinguished. And we are then following this nitrogen, or this heavy nitrogen, into the coastal waters and the organisms there. And of course, what we can also see there is we have this high delta 15N in the tissue of seagrass leaves. So this is what you see on the left panel. We have the delta 15N in leaves of Thalassia hemprichi, which is the most abundant seagrass in the area. And again, we see the highest values close to the source, to the aquaculture effluents, and then decreasing with distance. So there's while the water masses are traveling, seagrasses are taking up the aquaculture nitrogen. That, of course, is then being decreased, and that's why we see this gradient. So there's a high amount of aquaculture nitrogen, ammonium available close to the coast, and it's taken up by the seagrasses, while in larger distance of the coast, there's not that much aquaculture nitrogen. That's why the delta 15N is a bit lower. Nevertheless, if we look on the right-hand side panel, we see these values in comparison to what we find around the globe. And we see that the delta 15N that we find there in seagrass leaves of Thalassia hemprichi are by far the highest on the globe, even higher than those in Indonesia, where also aquaculture is a major source of nitrogen to the seagrasses there. So we see, as mentioned earlier, it's an extreme example. We have this elevated delta 15N, which is a hint for this anthropogenic origin, and here in particular of this aquaculture effluent that we find in seagrass tissue. And this is how it looks like. This is a photograph taken by my former PhD student, Lucia Herbeck. You see how it looks like. It's again really demonstrating you the effect of eutrophication. Too many nutrients leads to too many algae. So the water is really murky. There's a lot of phytoplankton in a lot of particles in the water because of the high nutrients. But as you can see, the seagrasses are also covered by a lot of algae, the so-called epiphytes. So there's a lot of algae also growing on the seagrasses. They are competitors for the nutrients and competitors for the light. So all this contributes to shading and impairs the photosynthetic activity of the seagrasses. And if they are totally covered, after some time, they will die. And this is what I'm showing you in the next slide. Here we have the seagrass density that we find in the area. In the upper two panels, we see the seagrass abundance and diversity in 2 seasons, in autumn 2008 and spring 2009. And on the left-hand side, in the area of Yilin, where we have a low aquaculture input, we have the highest abundances and also the highest diversity, a total of 7 species of seagrass in the area. And if we look at the middle and the right-hand side panel in Qingge and Changchi, the areas with medium to high aquaculture impact, we see that we have a much lower abundances and also less species of seagrasses in the areas. And then we sent another PhD student in 2017 to do all the analysis again. And our student, Esther Thompson, was phoning us, telling us, oh, the seagrass is gone. What shall I do now? And of course, we told her, continue with the same methods as we did before. And she took up what we found there. And in fact, there was some seagrass and also still the highest species numbers in Yilin, but or very reduced abundances and also less species. But if we look into the areas of Qingge and Changqi, there was almost no seagrass left. So in about 10 years, most of the seagrass there really died as the effect of what we've just seen. So with the large data set that we acquired over these 10 years, Esther was able to, with sophisticated statistics, to find groupings and a major driver of this seagrass death, and this is dissolved inorganic nitrogen. So what she came up with is 3 groups of seagrasses, and we see in the first group here, in the group number 1, we see there's quite good seagrass biomass, around about 200 grams dry weight per square meter. So this is a quite high abundance, and this is what happens when DIN concentrations are less than 0.9 micromoles on the long term, not only for a one-term measurement. And then there was a second large group in the range of 0.9 to 8 micromoles of dissolved inorganic nitrogen with a much lower biomass, but still surviving. And on the right-hand side, you see the group number 3 at concentrations of 8 micromole of DIN over years or decades. There's almost no seagrass left. Yeah? So this is an important result of this long-term research, that we identified such a seagrass survival threshold. If you expose seagrasses over a decade or 2 decades to a concentration, an average concentration of 8 micromoles DIN, then seagrasses will die. And this is important, that it must be long-term, not just one single-time measurement. This is also something that we can see if we look at the distribution of individual data. Again, it's mostly the same as we saw before. So this is, again, seagrass biomass on the y-axis, plotted versus dissolved inorganic nitrogen concentration on the x-axis in micromoles. And if we look at the upper panel, we see in green the Yilin data, so this area with least exposure to aquaculture effluents, and we see that most of these data plot, of course, in this very low range of DIN, but you see also some green dots at larger DIN concentrations, which means if they can also thrive in waters which have higher concentrations, but only short term, not on the long term. And then if we look at the Changqi data, for example, so the red dots, we see most of them plot in the upper part of the second section, or on the right-hand side in the very high DIN concentrations, which means they are mostly exposed on the long term to high concentrations of DIN, which means that most of the seagrasses will not survive. In the lower panel, we see this plotted also for other areas. There's very few data in the literature, and there's almost no long-term data. But we also see in particular other works from China showing that in many areas the biomasses are very low, and also the DIN concentrations are fairly high. And in none of the areas from which we have data, they are in this very good, the green smiley window. Yeah? So obviously it's a threat also in other areas. So we see the effect of this aquaculture nitrogen that it has on the seagrasses. But of course, we also find it somewhere else, and we also found it in the sediments. What you see on this slide are the results of biogeochemical investigations of short sediment cores that we took in the lagoon close to these mangroves and also to the aquaculture ponds. The upper part shows you a core that we took directly in the mangrove area, and the lower part shows you the results of a core that we took from the coast, close to the mangrove, but also close to the aquaculture ponds. And I just want you to focus on the right two panels where we have the isotope data, the delta 13C org and the delta 15N, just to get an idea on the sources of the organic matter that we find in these sediments. And the green shaded area just shows you the major mangrove origin of this organic matter, while the blue shaded area shows you the more planktonic marine origin of organic matter. So if we take a look at the upper part at the mangrove, we see that over the entire time, that it's there roughly 30 years or 40 years, that most of the organic matter being deposited in the mangroves is of mangrove origin. That's, of course, not very surprising. But if we take a look at the lower panel, we also see a kind of oscillation between these two areas, mangrove and planktonic origin. And we see there's always a large contribution of mangrove carbon, of course, because the mangroves are close to this lagoon and they are also exporting. But we see there's also a considerable portion which is of planktonic and marine origin, which was increasing in particular after 1990 and it got very high in the 2000s. This can nicely be seen again if we look at the delta 15N as being our tracer for the aquaculture nitrogen. So we see there's a high delta 15N after 1990, and it indicates that we have more organic matter of planktonic marine origin being deposited in the sediments of the lagoon. And this is a result of this eutrophication of the coastal waters. There was more planktonic production, and that means also more settling of particulate organic matter to the sediments and less from the mangroves, although the contribution is still there. So this high impact of aquaculture and the high production and the high release of anthropogenic nitrogen into the environment is also documented in the sediments, not only shown in the seagrass, but also in the sediments. And then we were also following this anthropogenic nitrogen along the food web, so all the organisms that are around there. And we had a lot of organisms from there, including fish. So we had covered roughly about 3 to 4 trophic levels. And we see in green and in yellow highlighted the primary producers, the mangroves, and the micro and macro algae in this dual stable isotope plot, where we have delta 13C data on the x-axis and delta 15N again on the y-axis. And you see in the mangrove areas, so the green dots, the light green, you see they have much lower values than those of the other primary producers, the micro and macro algae. And again, this is the result of this high impact from the aquaculture effluent. So they have a much higher delta 15N than the mangroves. And we see, if we look at the upper trophic levels, and in blue we have the gastropods and the bivalves, then in red we have crustaceans, and in gray we have fish. There's a steady increase in delta 13C and also delta 15N, which is also related to this high impact aquaculture effluent impact. So that means we can trace this anthropogenic nitrogen that is being released from aquaculture ponds also along the food web in the area. Yeah, so if we sum this up then, and this is something that we, this idealized sketch that we produced for a policy brief that we recently published for decision makers in the area, just showing you what happened over the past or in the second half of the last century and also in the first 2 decades of this century. What happened there is there was a dramatic loss of mangrove area, about 72%, mostly directly converted into aquaculture ponds, and all these effluents were being released into coastal waters. And we've seen that we have this survival threshold of 8 micromoles DIN exposure on the long term for seagrasses. So a lot of them died because they are exposed to these very high concentrations for more than 2 decades. And that's why a lot of these seagrasses also died. It's about a 87% loss that we identified. And of course, it also affects the coral reefs. You have seen the photos I've shown you. This is also to a large extent the result of this eutrophication, that is because the mangroves were removed. Mangroves as a sink of land-derived substances were removed and replaced by a source of nitrogen. And so there was too many nutrients, too much eutrophication. There's more reasons for the degradation of these coastal ecosystems there that are mentioned in the graph. I will not explain them today, but there's more. So this brings us back to one slide that we've seen before, this ecosystem connectivity, and this example from Hainan has clearly shown that this mangrove loss also it disrupts many of these connections between these coastal ecosystems, and it also impairs a lot of the other ecosystems. So mangroves have important ecosystems in themselves, but they also have important functions for the ecosystem service supply of other adjacent ecosystem, coastal ecosystems. And of course, coming back to the major theme of this conference, mangrove loss also means a reduction of the fishery potential in the mangroves, but also in the adjacent coastal systems. Because one of the results that we also had in Hainan, which I have not shown here, is there was a strong reduction in fishery yield over the decades. So there was only a lot of small fish left. And this is to some extent also related, of course, to the loss of mangroves. So to sum up, we've seen that the conversion of mangroves to aquaculture means replacing a sink for land-derived nitrogen and other substances, of course, with a source. And this aquaculture effluent release, in our case, we were mostly looking at this anthropogenic nitrogen, into the coastal waters leads to eutrophication there. And this and the consequences of the eutrophication impair all the downstream coastal habitats, mostly seagrasses and the coral reefs. And another consequence is also that this important coastal ecosystem connectivity is disrupted, and then also the ecosystem service supply to society, to us, as people living near the coast or along the coast, is diminished. And finally, it means that mangroves supply important ecosystem services. Yes, but they are also an important nursery and shelter for a lot of organisms. And as such, they support the fisheries potential of coastal regions in the mangroves and in the adjacent ecosystems. So I'm at the end now. I want to thank you for listening. Thank you again for inviting me. This is a photograph I took when I visited Kerala the last time. I think it was in 2018. And we had a very nice trip in the Ashtamudi Lake and also in the Kalada River. I think Dr. Salom and Dr. Prince were with me at the time. I really enjoyed that time and that particular day, and I really like this photograph. So thank you for listening. And here I've listed a couple of the papers that were reporting on the work that I've just shown, but also on the blue carbon. I'm very sorry that we have a technical problem. I don't know why. Yesterday we had a try and everything worked perfectly. Today it is different. Yeah, sorry for that, but thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to take questions. So there's a question on how eutrophication affects the productivity. Yeah, there's it can be beneficial and can also be a problem. Like always, eutrophication is not necessarily always a problem. We know there's natural eutrophication and upwelling systems, and we know that upwelling systems are also very rich in fish, so they are important fishing grounds. So it always depends on the level of eutrophication. We have also seen this in the seagrasses here, that there was a degree. So to some extent it's beneficial, but we've also seen there's a survival threshold. So if it's more than 8 moles of DIN, in the long term, seagrasses will die. If it is less, it can be beneficial. And this is also what you can find in the mangroves. So there are not too many studies, but there are some on eutrophication in mangroves, in particular by Candy Feller and other people, that shows that to some extent, well, nutrient enrichment, maybe not eutrophication, can be beneficial for mangrove growth. But of course, if it's too much, it can also be a problem. For example, there was a study in the arid mangroves in the Middle East, which also showed that enrichment in combination with water scarcity can also lead to mangrove loss, because then higher growth can also impose water stress on the plants, which can lead to death. So it's very complex. And what I've seen in Hainan, for example, that there's a lot of macroalgae growing or macroalgae just being in the mangrove trees. So there is some effect of eutrophication also there. We've seen it, but we have not studied it or quantified it. But large-scale eutrophication may also be a problem for the mangroves. So then there's a question on the role of higher salinity in DIN dynamics. Well, so generally when we're in the estuarine gradient, we know there's estuarine mixing, and most of the conversion of, for example, dissolved into particulate substance or another way around is in the lower salinity range, let's say 0 to 15 PSU. So and most of these intertidal systems have a higher salinity, so it will not affect the DIN dynamics too much, I would say. So the next question is it feasible to reclaim the mangrove ecosystem that is already converted to aquaculture ponds? Well, in the past decades, there has been a lot of large increase in conservation and restoration efforts. So the mangrove loss rates have decreased dramatically. And there's also growth of mangroves or regrowth of mangroves in many instances. It is possible, and we know there are and have been efforts of replanting for decades, but which also had major losses. Tens of millions of dollars were used and wasted to some extent for planting tens of millions of propagules, but in many cases without knowing how to do that. Most important for the growth of mangroves or the regrowth is the environmental setting, the physical setting. So in most cases, it's most important to restore the hydrodynamics of an area, and then the propagules will come back by themselves, more or less, and start to settle. And it's also important, what you often have is monoculture plantings, which is also not very successful. So you have to cover the diversity that you have and the species which you naturally have in the area. So it's not helpful to plant alien species which are usually growing in other areas. So that's very important to combine these, the environmental setting, to have a look at the physics, and then if you plant in a manner that's very useful, not just going and hoping that I plant millions of propagules and then I have a luxurious mangrove forest in a couple of years. It's not that simple. So, any buffer to reduce the organic nitrogen level in mangrove ecosystems? Well, the mangroves are themselves buffers. They are taking out some of the land-derived substances, because in general, mangrove forests are nutrient-poor ecosystems, so they always need external input. They are doing it through nitrogen fixation. They have a lot of bacteria which can fix nitrogen, and then of course in case where you have river inputs, you have this terrestrial input of nutrients, and through the tides you also have inputs from the marine environment. But again, it's always a matter of the dose. If there's too much of a good thing, then mangroves can die, and then they cannot filter out all the nitrogen. So if the input is too high from the landward side, which over the years or over the decades was mainly from agriculture, then a part of it can be taken out by the mangroves, but not all of it. And so the rest is then introduced into the coastal ocean, leading to the eutrophication that we observe all around the globe. So mangroves are a natural filter, and that's another important function of them. Is they can take out some of this nitrogen, but not all of it. So there's a question for the policy to restore the mangrove. Yeah, one of so mangroves got a lot more awareness in the past 2 decades. One of the important events that was also mentioned, I think, by Dr. Jaya in the beginning, was the tsunami in 2004, and Pechavaram was one of the major examples that was shown around the world and discussed in the media also, where these intact mangroves provided coastal protection. And also this carbon storage. I did this in the past 2 decades, and I was working on the carbon stored in mangroves long before it was called blue carbon. But with this term being coined in 2009, it got much more awareness. among scientists, but also in this public and also on the policy level. So and that led to much more research, to much more knowledge on mangroves, and also to much more awareness in society and also among decision makers, which means that that the policy regarding conservation and restoration also changed, and there's an increase in conservation and restoration also because of this growing awareness in society and among decision makers. So disposal of aquaculture effluents. How can they be disposed? The best would be to avoid it. That means you have to have a better management of the aquaculture, maybe apply less feed and less fertilizers, and have a look of how much is needed. So there's also that's an important part that coastal managers can do. But of course, they care mostly for the economy and say the more feed and fertilizers they use, and it's fairly cheap, the more harvest they have. But that also means that there's a release of this in the environment, and the damages that can be caused by this may even be higher. But of course, the isolated view on the business then would say, I don't care for the environment. That's maybe a part of the tragedy of the commons that we see there also. Net productivity change when mangrove ecosystem converted to aquaculture ponds. So, well, if the productivity of the mangrove ecosystem is meant, of course, when the mangrove is not there anymore, there's no productivity. One thing I may say is, if you look at the carbon storage that was mentioned, the blue carbon, then you could say that, and there you also find, in a way, mangrove or sediments in the aquaculture ponds also, and of course they also store carbon, but there's only a few studies so far. But what they say is that the carbon stock that is then being produced there is in aquaculture ponds, or in the sediments in aquaculture ponds, is much lower than the carbon stock in mangrove ecosystem deposits. So I think the latest question is also referring to that, the carbon sink difference. Yeah, there's also investigations now on the carbon storage in restored ecosystems. And what could be seen so far, and there's only a very few studies available, that restored mangroves also have a higher carbon stock than aquaculture ponds, for example. But these carbon stocks are not as high as those of natural or pristine or almost unaltered natural mangroves. So there is an increase of the carbon stock, but it's not as high as the natural mangroves. But of course, this may also be something that needs to be assessed on a longer term. But of course, what can be assessed now in the restored mangroves is only in the over a few years or maybe a decade or so, because it's just starting this mangrove ecosystem restoration.